Before we invite up Professor Kotler to present our next award, I would like to invite once again all our NGO partners, the co-sponsors, to please come forward and join us on the stage for the next presentation. And, as I said before, in Geneva, there was no better person to present the Women's Rights Award than the first woman president of Switzerland, who devoted much of her career to fighting for women's rights and gender equality. The same applies here when we're giving an award to a Russian democracy defender. There is no one more fitting to present that award than someone who has devoted decades of his human rights career to fighting for democracy and freedom and human rights in what was then the Soviet Union and what is now Russia, and had his own personal experiences, difficulties from those governments. I just want to make a comment, which is when I was outside and I saw there's two images. Someone took some photos that were tweeted. There were images of dozens of political prisoners and how many days they've been in prison. And then you could also see in the background of the picture a giant poster of Professor Kotler saying that if you want to seek justice, you have to feel the injustice around you. And Professor Kotler is a lawyer for many of the political prisoners who are hanging up there. So with that, I would like to call up my teacher, Professor Erwin Kotler, to present our Courage Award.
Thanks, Hilo. All I can say is that after having had the pleasure of attending all of the UN summits for rights and democracy, I can say with great pride that I am your student and you are the teacher and advocate for all of us. So thank you, Hilo. It's a great honor and privilege to present the Moral Courage Award to my friend and colleague Vladimir Kara-Murza, a human rights hero who is the embodiment of moral courage, a human rights defender twice poisoned for his courageous defense of human rights, a democracy advocate at the forefront of the struggle for democracy in Putin's Russia, a public intellectual who speaks truth to power and holds power accountable to truth, a global leader in the movement of justice for Sergei Magnitsky to combat the cultures of criminality, of corruption, the cultures of impunity of which we have spoken, and where, as Boris Nemtsov, his and my mentor, spoke of this as being the most pro-Russian legislation. And indeed, I'm delighted that in October, Canada became the 5th country to adopt unanimously global justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation. And immediately upon adopting the legislation, so that it wouldn't just be a declaration on paper, and in the spirit of what Alfred Moses was telling us, in the immediate aftermath of adopting it, sanctioned 51 human rights violators, 30 Russians, 18 Venezuelans, and 3 South Sudanese, and that's only the beginning. A documentary filmmaker whose inspiring documentaries have documented the heroism of the dissident movement in the former Soviet Union and the singular heroism of Boris Nemtsov, the prototypical human rights defender, Democrat, and leader of the parliamentary opposition in Russia, and who was assassinated 3 years ago. And next week, we will be unveiling a memorial, a plaza in remembrance and in tribute to Boris Nemtsov in Washington, opposite the Russian embassy, an initiative that has been brought about by the steadfast involvement and commitment of Vladimir Kara-Murza. So when we unveil the plaza 1 week from today, we should remember and pay tribute also to Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is making this possible. The human rights heroes of moral courage, like Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is sui generis, a one and only, embody and advance the great struggle for freedom and dignity and democracy in our time. And so it is an honor for me, a privilege, and really a distinct pleasure to be able to present to Vladimir Kara-Murza the Moral Courage Award, as I said, for a person who is the embodiment of moral courage. Vladimir.
Thank you, Urban. Thank you, Hillel. Dear friends, thank you so very much. I'm deeply grateful to the organizers, hosts, partners, and co-sponsors of the Geneva Summit, and deeply humbled to be receiving this award. And it's a special privilege to receive it from the hands of my dear friend, Professor Erwin Kotler, a towering figure in the global human rights movement who has worked with and on behalf of such leaders as Nelson Mandela, Anatoly Sharansky, Jacobo Timmerman, and Andrei Sakharov. For his work over the years, Erwin has been honored with awards that are too numerous to count, but I do want to single out one in particular. In March of 2014, by the order of Vladimir Putin, Erwin Kotler was placed under a Russian government travel ban. And as Erwin himself has said, coming from the present Kremlin regime, this certainly is a badge of honor. And I know that one day it will be an honor for us to welcome Erwin Kotler in Russia when our country is finally free from this authoritarian kleptocracy. Erwin, thank you for everything you do. Russia is not usually the first country that comes to mind when people think of such notions as liberty, democracy, or human dignity. The prevailing stereotypes are the opposite. And yet some of the strongest and some of the most inspiring leaders in the human rights movement, certainly in the 20th century, have come from Russia. And I think it's telling that Europe's highest award for contributions to the fight for human rights, that is given annually by the European Parliament, the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought, is named after a Russian citizen. The story of Andrei Sakharov and the Soviet dissident movement is, for me, one of the most inspiring and ultimately one of the most optimistic stories of the 20th century. The story of a relatively small group of people, armed only with their word and their sense of dignity, that in the end proved stronger than a mighty totalitarian state and the world's most developed machine of repression. It was never about numbers. As Sakharov himself has said, it is not a case of arithmetic, but of a qualitative fact, breaching the psychological barrier of silence. It doesn't take many to breach that barrier. In August 1968, as Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia, and as the Soviet government claimed unanimous support among its citizens for the invasion, 7 brave Russians came onto Red Square in Moscow to protest against it. They were arrested within minutes. They were all sent to prison, internal exile, or psychiatric hospitals. But after what they did, no one could say that all Soviet citizens supported the invasion of Czechoslovakia. As the Prague newspaper Literárny Listy wrote at that time, there are now at least 7 reasons for which we will never be able to hate the Russian people. A few years ago, I interviewed one of those 7, Natalia Gorbanevskaya. She's passed away since. It was for a documentary I was making about the Soviet dissident movement. And I asked her what motivated her to go to that square, knowing for certain what price she would have to pay. And I'll never forget what she answered. She said, for me, going to that demonstration was a selfish act. I wanted to have a clean conscience. This award is presented for courage. I don't know if we are courageous, stubborn maybe, and perhaps a little selfish in the sense that Natalia Gorbanevskaya meant it. But what we certainly are is unwilling to be complicit in the crimes of a regime that claims to speak on behalf of our country. It is a powerful motivation. I know it was for Boris Nemtsov, the leader of the democratic opposition in Russia. For years, his was the strongest and the loudest and the clearest voice against the authoritarianism, corruption, and aggressiveness of the Putin regime. He publicized abuses by government officials, organized demonstrations against election fraud and against domestic repression, campaigned for international accountability in the form of targeted sanctions on human rights abuses. And when the Kremlin started another war, this time on Ukraine, in 2014, he led not 7, but tens of thousands of people through the streets of Moscow in protest. I remember that day well. The line of Muscovites who came to say no to Mr. Putin's war stretched for miles down the boulevard ring from Pushkin Square to Sakharov Avenue. And when those of us in front had reached the end point, people were still lining up to go through metal detectors at the beginning. Boris Nemtsov didn't have to do what he did. A part of Russia's top political establishment, member of parliament, regional governor, first deputy prime minister, a one-time heir to the Russian presidency, he could have easily settled for a quiet and comfortable existence under the present regime, as so many others have. But he cared about our country too much to watch its future being destroyed by authoritarians and kleptocrats, and he did not want to be complicit. He was smeared on state television as a traitor, physically assaulted by pro-Kremlin groups, repeatedly arrested at peaceful demonstrations, but he would not relent. He was silenced the only way he could be, by 5 bullets in his back as he walked across a bridge in front of the Kremlin. As Boris himself once said, freedom does not come cheap. It was the greatest privilege of my life to work with Boris Nemtsov for 15 years. He taught me, with his own example, that politics can be honest and that you must always stand up for your principles, whatever the cost. As so often in our country's history, the political cost and the personal cost of dissent in Russia today is high. When Andrei Sakharov wrote his Nobel lecture, which he was not allowed to go to Oslo to deliver in 1975, he named in it 126 prisoners of conscience in the Soviet Union. Today, according to Memorial, we have 117 political prisoners in our country. They are a diverse group. They include Oleg Sentsov, a Crimean film director who protested against the annexation. Alexander Shpakov, a carpenter from the Moscow region who attended an anti-corruption rally. Dmitry Buchenkov, who was not even at the protest demonstration for which he is being tried. Oleg Navalny, the brother of anti-corruption campaigner and banned presidential candidate Alexei Navalny. And Alexei Pichugin, the remaining hostage of the Yukos case, who after almost 15 years is now Russia's longest-serving political prisoner. Sometimes we encounter more creative methods. Twice in the past 3 years, in May of 2015 and again in February of last year, both times in Moscow, I experienced symptoms of severe poisoning that left me with a multiple organ failure, in a coma and on life support. It was certainly intended to kill. Both times doctors told my wife that they estimated the chance of survival at about 5%. The message was clear enough. But so is my response. Now for the second time, you will not see us run. You will not see us hide. You will not see us give up. As Boris Nemtsov always said, this is our country. we have to fight for it. And if we really believe in our principles, we must be prepared to stand up for them. We know that these principles are important for many people in Russia. We know this despite the long-held stereotype that Russians are somehow uniquely unsuited or not ready for democracy and freedom, that all we need is a strong hand and a stern whip. That stereotype is shallow. It is insulting, but most importantly, it is not true. Because every time the Russian people could actually choose in a more or less free election between dictatorship and democracy, they always chose democracy. In 1906, when the constitutional Democrats trounced autocratic parties in the first Duma election. In a Constituent Assembly vote of 1917, when Bolshevik usurpers lost to proponents of a parliamentary republic. In 1991, when Democratic presidential candidate Boris Yeltsin defeated the Communist Party by 57% to 17%. Today, we're often told that Vladimir Putin is very popular among Russian citizens, that he's supported by 86%, that he is, to quote his own press secretary, the absolute leader on the political Olympus with whom no one can seriously compete, end of quote. That last statement is actually true. It is difficult to compete when you're in prison, in exile, or dead. It is difficult to compete and receive many votes if you're not actually allowed on a ballot. It is difficult to speak and hear the truth when all television channels are controlled by the state. But the next time someone tells you that Vladimir Putin is popular, just ask them, why would such a popular leader be so afraid of a free election? Your popularity is not worth much if you have to back it up with such intimidation, censorship, and fraud. And yet, despite all of this, there are more and more people in Russia who are prepared to stand up to the corruption and abuses of Mr. Putin's Kremlin. I've met many of them all across the country as part of my work with Open Russia, a political movement that seeks to restore the rule of law, democratic elections, and accountable government. Our work is mainly with the young people, the new generation of democratic activists. Through our training and educational programs, through projects aimed at encouraging political participation and civic engagement, we want to empower them and help them become active and informed citizens. We want to help them gain the skills and the experience they will need when they face the task of building a new Russia on the ruins of yet another authoritarian system. We are already seeing this new generation. In these last few months, thousands of people went to the streets all across Russia to voice their protest at the pervasive government corruption, the lack of accountability, the sham elections, and the sheer arrogance of the same small group of people that has now been in power for almost 2 decades. These protests took place in more than 200 towns and cities, large and small, across 11 time zones, from Kaliningrad to Khabarovsk. And the vast majority of those who came were young people, university and high school students, many in their late teens and early 20s. They are literally the future of Russia. They're also the people who were certainly raised and in many cases born under Vladimir Putin. And yet they are increasingly saying enough. And in the end, there's not much Mr. Putin will be able to do about that. Of our friends in democratic countries, we ask only one thing. Please stay true to your values. We're not asking for your support. It is our task to change Russia, and we will do it ourselves. The only thing we ask from you is that you do not support Mr. Putin by treating him as a respectable partner on the world stage and by allowing his cronies to use your countries as havens for their looted wealth. Please don't enable corruption and human rights abuse in Russia by welcoming their perpetrators on your soil and in your banks. 6 years ago this month, Erwin Kotler hosted Boris Nemtsov on Parliament Hill in Ottawa as he launched an effort to pass the Magnitsky Law in Canada, a law that would lay down a very simple principle, that those who violate the most basic norms of democratic society in their own countries should not be entitled to enjoy the privileges of democratic society in the West by traveling or holding assets there. Despite the obstacles and the resistance and the realpolitik, Erwin Kotler has succeeded, and this measure is now the law of the land in Canada, as it is in 5 other countries, including the United States. It was a privilege to work with parliamentarians from these countries to help make it possible, and I'm proud of my small part in this process. And we hope that more democratic nations, including the one in which we are meeting today, will take a principled stand and send a message that crooks and abusers are no longer welcome. And above all, please stop falling for that tired and dishonest stereotype that Russians are somehow uniquely unsuited or not ready for democracy. We are suited, we are ready, and we will get there, just like you. As Soviet dissidents have shown us, all it takes, in the end, is a certain number of committed individuals who refuse to be complicit, who are prepared to stand up for their principles, and who succeed in breaching that barrier of silence.